History remembers the Colosseum as a theatre of sunlight and glory, a place where sand drank the blood of heroes. We are told of the polis verso, the turned thumb, and the roar of 50,000 souls celebrating a warrior's prowess. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the crowds went home, the stadium didn't fall silent. It began to breathe a different kind of horror. For the female prisoners of war, the mercy of a spared life was often a cruel joke played by the fates. To be captured by Rome was to lose your name. To be awarded to a gladiator was to lose your soul. Beyond the courage and the gilded armor lay a dark, predatory reality where victory for the man meant a living nightmare for the woman. Tonight, we step out of the golden light of the arena and into the damp, torch-lit cells of the ludus to uncover a fate that many victims prayed would have ended on the sword's edge. The moment the heavy iron gates of the ludus creaked open, the transition from person to property was finalized with terrifying bureaucratic precision. These women were not merely refugees of a lost war, they were the physical manifestations of Roman dominance, handed over as munera, or gifts, to the men who had bled for the crowd's amusement. For a high-born Gaulish daughter or a Germanic queen, the sight of the gladiator, sweaty, blood-stained, and smelling of the arena's copper-scented sand, was the ultimate harbinger of her new, suffocating reality. There was no trial or appeal, only the cold exchange of chains from the legionnaire's hand to the gladiator's calloused grip. The barracks became a cage where the social hierarchy of the outside world was burned away, leaving only the raw, brutal dynamic of the conqueror and the conquered. Within the damp, torchlit corridors of the training school, the lanista distributed these women like rations or equipment to his most profitable stars. To the gladiator, a female prisoner was a reward for surviving the morning's slaughter, a prize meant to soothe the jagged nerves of a man who lived on the edge of the grave. She was expected to mend his tunics, prepare his meager meals, and endure his volatile temper as the adrenaline of the fight curdled into a dark, restless energy. This was a domesticity forged in violence, where the woman was forced to facilitate the very lifestyle that had destroyed her own family and homeland. The psychological weight of serving the man who might have personally struck down her kin was a burden that many found heavier than any iron shackle. The physical environment of the ludus offered no sanctuary and no privacy, stripping away the last remnants of dignity these women desperately tried to cling to. They slept on thin straw mats, within earshot of the clashing practice swords and the rhythmic grunts of men training for the next day's carnage. Every meal they served and every wound they dressed for their masters was a reminder of their powerlessness in a society that viewed them as mere animated tools. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and fear, a sensory prison that never allowed the mind to drift back to the sun-drenched fields of a former life. Their presence in the barracks served as a constant ego boost for the fighters, reinforcing the idea that the gladiator, though an outcast himself, was a king within these stone walls. To the Roman public, this arrangement was a natural extension of the victory rites, a way to ensure that the beasts of the arena remained tethered to a sense of animalistic satisfaction. The female prisoner became a silent witness to the gladiator's inner terrors, forced to soothe the nightmares of a man who was simultaneously her protector and her primary tormentor. If a gladiator fell in the arena the following week, his property was simply reclaimed and reassigned, passed like a piece of used armor to the next victor in line. This cycle of constant displacement meant that these women could never form stable bonds or find a moment of peace, as their entire existence was tied to the lethal luck of a stranger's sword. The systemic nature of this ownership was designed to break the spirit through sheer exhausting repetition until the woman's original identity was nothing more than a ghost. As the sun set over the Roman skyline, the shadows in the barracks grew long, swallowing the muffled sobs of those who had once been princesses and mothers. They were now the invisible infrastructure of the gladiators' fame, the silent victims whose suffering was never recorded in the glorious mosaics or the celebratory inscriptions of the empire. While the names of the fighters were shouted in the streets, the names of the women in the ludus were forgotten by history, buried under the weight of a victory that demanded everything from them. This was the first stage of a fate worse than death, the slow, agonizing erasure of the self in the service of an enemy's triumph. Their survival was not a mercy, but a prolonged sentence of servitude, played out in the dark underbelly of the world's most famous theater of death. The transition from the battlefield to the ludus was merely the beginning of a systematic dismantling of the female prisoner's humanity and pride. Once inside the barracks, these women were subjected to rituals of humiliation designed to satisfy the gladiator's ego and the Lannister's need for absolute control. They were often forced to stand before the gathered fighters, stripped of their native garments and redressed in the drab, coarse wool of the Roman slave. This visual erasure served to remind them that their titles, their lineages, and their very names had been surrendered to the dust of the arena floor. To the gladiators, this display was a psychological decompression, allowing them to exert power over a defenseless victim after facing the terror of death. The air in the courtyard would grow thick with the sound of mocking laughter as the women were made to perform menial or degrading tasks in full view of their captors. Every movement a prisoner made was scrutinized and mocked, turning her basic survival into a public spectacle for the amusement of the training school's inhabitants. She might be forced to wash the blood-caked armor of the man who killed her countrymen, a task designed to trigger the deepest possible psychological trauma. This was not accidental cruelty, but a calculated effort to ensure the captive understood her place at the very bottom of the Roman social hierarchy. By forcing these women to participate in the glorification of their own conquerors, the Romans achieved a total victory that went far beyond the physical constraints of a prison cell. The repetitive nature of this degradation meant that the prisoners lived in a state of constant, simmering shame, unable to find a single moment of dignity. In this environment, the gladiator was not just a fighter, but a master of a miniature kingdom where his word was the only law that mattered. The psychological warfare extended to the dining halls, where female prisoners were often forced to wait on the gladiators during their rowdy post-match celebrations. They were treated as inanimate objects or living trophies, moved around the room like furniture to serve the whims of men intoxicated by wine and the adrenaline of recent combat. If a woman showed a spark of her former defiance, it was quickly extinguished through public reprimands that served as a warning to all other captives in the ludus. The lack of privacy was perhaps the most biting form of humiliation, as every intimate moment of grief or exhaustion was laid bare for the guards and fighters to witness. They were denied the luxury of a private cry or a moment of reflection, as the architecture of the barracks was designed for constant, invasive surveillance. This total exposure ensured that the prisoner's spirit was under constant assault, leaving no room for the internal cultivation of hope or resistance. Furthermore, the captives were often forced to witness the celebration of the very rituals that had led to their own enslavement and the death of their kin. They had to stand by as the gladiators recounted their kills, describing in vivid detail the final moments of the men these women had once loved and respected. Being forced to nod or smile during these narrations was a soul-crushing requirement that turned the women into unwilling participants in their own cultural destruction. The Lannister encouraged this behavior, believing that a broken and humiliated slave was far less likely to cause trouble or attempt a futile escape from the stone walls. This environment created a profound sense of isolation, where the prisoner felt alienated not only from the world, but from her own sense of self-respect and history. The systematic stripping of their identity was a weapon more effective than any blade, ensuring they remained compliant through the sheer weight of their collective misery. By the time the moon rose over the training grounds, the day's humiliations had left the women hollowed out and emotionally exhausted beyond any measure of repair. They were forced to endure the nocturnal games of the barracks, where the lines between domestic service and sadistic entertainment became blurred and increasingly dangerous. There was no recourse for the abuse they suffered, as the Roman legal system viewed them as mere property with no more rights than a stray dog. The gladiator, himself a social pariah, found a twisted sense of validation in being able to dominate a woman who might have once looked down upon him from a palace. This inversion of the natural social order was the ultimate goal of the ludus, proving that under the shadow of the eagle, everyone was a servant. The result was a living death, a state where the body continued to breathe while the spark of the individual was systematically snuffed out by the darkness. The cold logic of the Roman Empire extended into the very biology of its captives, turning the ludus into a factory of human capital. Victorious gladiators were often encouraged to father children with the female prisoners, a practice that ensured a self-sustaining cycle of labor and future combatants for the arena. These women were viewed not as mothers, but as vessels for the production of the sextus class, a category of slaves born within the walls of the training school. From the moment of conception, the child was legally the property of the Lannister, the gladiator's manager, who viewed the infant as a future return on investment. The mother was forced to raise her child in the same shadows that had swallowed her own freedom, knowing the child's fate was already signed away. This commodification of the womb was perhaps the most enduring horror, as it transformed a natural bond into a weapon of state-sponsored exploitation. For the captive woman, the birth of a child was not a moment of joy, but a sentence of perpetual attachment to her tormentors. She was forced to watch as her son or daughter was groomed from a young age to serve the very institution that had enslaved her entire lineage. These children were raised in the presence of blood and iron, their first memories shaped by the metallic clang of training swords and the scent of the arena. There was no hope of a better life for them, as the law dictated that the status of the child followed the status of the mother's servitude. The gladiator father might feel a fleeting sense of pride in his offspring, but he had no legal right to protect or claim them as his own kin. This dynamic ensured that the prisoner remained trapped in a cycle of grief, watching the next generation inherit her chains and her scars. The lanista viewed these births with the same detached interest a farmer might show toward the breeding of prize livestock or healthy draft horses. A child born to a powerful, successful gladiator was seen as potentially possessing the physical traits necessary to become a profitable fighter in the future. The female prisoner was thus subjected to a form of selective breeding, her own preferences or desires completely ignored in favor of the school's economic interests. She had to endure the presence of the man who had fathered the child, often while he was being cheered for the deaths of her own people. This forced proximity created a psychological landscape of total despair, where the most intimate aspects of life were dictated by the cold hand of Roman commerce. The barracks were filled with the cries of infants who would never know a world beyond the stone walls and the sand of the training pit. As these children grew, the mother was forced to witness their innocence being systematically stripped away by the harsh realities of the gladiator's world. Her daughter might be trained for domestic service within the elite households of Rome, while her son was likely destined for the grueling path of a novice fighter. Every lesson they learned and every scar they earned was a reminder of the mother's inability to shield them from the cruelty of their masters. The bond between mother and child was treated as a secondary concern, easily severed if the lanista decided to sell one of them to settle a debt. This constant threat of separation served as a powerful tool of control, keeping the women compliant through the fear of losing the only thing they had left. The legacy of the arena was thus written in the bloodlines of those who were never meant to survive it, with their spirits intact. Ultimately, the breeding of the next generation was the ultimate triumph of the ludus over the human soul and the concept of family. It ensured that the trauma of conquest was not a single event, but a lingering generational curse that would continue long after the mother had perished. The female prisoners were forced to participate in the slow erasure of their own culture by raising children who spoke only Latin and knew only the Roman way of death. There was no room for ancestral stories or the traditions of a lost homeland in a place where survival was the only metric of success. By the time a prisoner reached the end of her life, she had seen her own blood transformed into the very tools that sustained the empire's thirst for blood. This was the true horror of the victory, a conquest that did not end with the sword, but continued through the cradle and into the grave. When the sun vanished and the official games concluded, the female prisoners were dragged from their cells to serve as the centerpiece of nocturnal games. These private banquets, held by Rome's decadent elite, transformed the trauma of the battlefield into a grotesque form of dinner theater for the wealthy. The women were often forced to dress in the traditional regalia of their fallen tribes, acting out the very moments of their capture for an audience of intoxicated senators. To the Roman aristocrat, this was a way to touch the danger of the frontier from the safety of a velvet couch. For the captive, it was a repetitive, soul-crushing reenactment of the worst day of her life performed for the laughter of her enemies. The dignity of their heritage was used as a costume, mocked by men who viewed their survival as a mere curiosity. The atmosphere of these banquets was thick with the scent of expensive wine, heavy perfumes, and the underlying rot of the arena's proximity. In this lawless space, the prisoners were subjected to sadistic tableaus where they were made to serve the gladiators who had defeated their kin. These heroes of the sand were often brought into the villas as muscle, and the women were used to showcase the gladiators' absolute mastery. A woman might be forced to stand perfectly still as a living cupbearer, while a fighter recounted how he had burned her village to the ground. There was no boundary between the public spectacle of the day and the private cruelty of the night, as every moment was curated to reinforce their status as property. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows that mirrored the instability of their lives, where a single wrong look could lead to immediate punishment. Psychological torture was a refined art at these gatherings, where the women were often forced to participate in mock battles that mimicked their own defeat. They were given wooden swords or dull blades and made to fight one another or fend off the advances of the gladiators for the guests' amusement. While no blood might be shed in these specific displays, the humiliation was a deeper wound that refused to close or heal. The elite watched with clinical detachment, discussing the women's physical attributes as if they were prize horses or exotic birds caught in a trap. This dehumanization ensured that the prisoners felt entirely disconnected from the world of the living, existing only as playthings for a bored and violent upper class. Every laugh from the banquet table was a hammer blow against their remaining sense of self-respect and hope. As the night wore on, the distinction between a banquet and a torture chamber often blurred into a haze of predatory behavior and calculated neglect. The women were frequently forced to witness the gladiators receiving gifts and accolades for the very violence that had orphaned or widowed them. They were the invisible witnesses to the spoils of war, standing in the corners of the room while the history of their people was rewritten by the victors. This proximity to power without any share in it was a unique form of agony, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what could never be regained. If a woman collapsed from exhaustion or grief, she was often discarded or punished publicly to ensure the festivities were not interrupted by her humanity. The Roman night was not a time of rest, but a continuation of the arena's demand for total and absolute submission. By the time the first light of dawn touched the city, the prisoners were ushered back to the ludus, empty and broken by the night's demands. These secret spectacles left no scars that a historian could easily track, yet they were the primary means of breaking the spirit of the conquered. The memory of being laughed at by the elite of Rome stayed with them longer than the weight of the iron chains around their ankles. It was a fate worse than death because it required them to remain alive and conscious while their identity was consumed by the fire of Roman vanity. The nocturnal games were the ultimate proof that in Rome, the victory was never finished until the victim's pride was entirely turned to ash. They returned to their straw mats, not as survivors, but as ghosts waiting for a silence that would never come. In the cold, unforgiving light of the Roman morning, the finality of a woman's enslavement was etched permanently into her very flesh. Beyond the chains and the stone walls, the most visceral horror was the ritual of branding, a process that transformed a human being into a labeled commodity. Victorious gladiators, despite their own status as social outcasts, were granted the right to mark their spoils with the symbols of their specific training schools or their own personal sigils. The smell of searing skin in the barracks courtyard was a frequent reminder that there was no returning to a life of freedom or anonymity. These marks were often placed on the forehead or the shoulder, ensuring that the woman's status as booty was visible to every passerby in the crowded streets. For the prisoner, the brand was a constant burning anchor to a man who lived for the thrill of the kill. The tools of this marking were as brutal as the men who wielded them, consisting of iron rods heated in the same braziers used to forge practice swords. As the red-hot metal met the skin, the captive was forced to endure a pain that symbolized the total erasure of her former social standing and family name. This was not merely a sign of ownership, it was a psychological weapon designed to make the woman feel physically lesser than the citizens she was forced to serve. The scar that remained was a jagged, silvery map of her defeat, a permanent reminder that her body was no longer her own, but belonged to the victor of the sand. Even if she were to escape, the brand would act as a beacon, alerting any Roman official to her status as a runaway and a piece of stolen property. In this way, the empire used the skin itself as a ledger for its triumphs and a cage for its victims. Moreover, many gladiators took a sadistic pride in these marks, sometimes adding intricate tattoos that signified the specific battle or year the woman was captured. These tattoos were often crude and painful, applied with soot and needles in the damp corners of the ludus, while the other fighters looked on with detached curiosity. By turning the woman's body into a canvas for his own achievements, the gladiator ensured that his legacy was literally carried by another human being. This practice intensified the bond of trauma between the captor and the captive, as she became a living trophy that he could display to his peers. To the Roman eyes, these markings were no different from the serial numbers on a piece of military equipment, reinforcing the idea that the woman had been successfully broken. The physical transformation was the final step in the process of turning a person into a ghost of their former self. The social implications of these brands were devastating as they stripped away any hope of a woman ever reintegrating into her own society if she were somehow ransomed. A woman marked by the brand of a gladiator was often viewed as tainted by her own people, a tragic irony that compounded her isolation and despair. She carried the mark of her oppressor like a stain that could never be washed away, regardless of how much time passed or how far she traveled. This led many women to a state of profound psychological collapse as they began to see themselves through the lens of the Roman masters who had labeled them. The mirror became an enemy, reflecting a face that bore the stamp of a man she likely loathed with every fiber of her being. The brand was the ultimate victory of the state over the individual, a permanent seal on a life of forced and unwanted service. As the years passed, these scars would thicken and fade, but the shame they represented never lost its sharp, stinging edge in the darkness of the barracks. Every time the woman caught a glimpse of the mark in a reflection or felt the raised tissue under her fingers, the trauma of the arena was renewed. It served as a silent, indelible witness to the moment she ceased to be a daughter, a wife, or a mother, and became a thing owned by a dealer in death. The gladiator might fall in the ring and be forgotten, but the woman he marked carried his legacy of violence until her final breath. This was the true cruelty of the system, a physical manifestation of a psychological death that preceded the actual end of life. In the shadow of the eagle, the skin was just another territory to be conquered, mapped and claimed by the iron will of Rome. The final and most devastating weapon in the Roman arsenal was the systematic erasure of the prisoner's internal world, a process of psychological hollow-out. This eradication of hope began in the spoliarium, the grim chambers where the bodies of fallen gladiators were stripped of their armor and dignity. To force a living woman to inhabit these spaces, surrounded by the literal echoes of death, was a calculated move to break her spirit. She was surrounded by the ghosts of her kin, her reality confined to the very rooms where her people had been processed like meat. This environment ensured that every breath she took was heavy with the scent of stagnant blood and cold, indifferent stone. By placing the living among the dead, the Romans ensured that the prisoner's mind would eventually succumb to a permanent, waking numbness. Within this landscape of despair, the concept of time became a torturous loop, where the past was a dream and the future was a void. The women were intentionally isolated from one another, preventing the formation of bonds that might lead to a collective resistance or shared comfort. Any mention of their former lives, their gods, their languages, or their children was often met with immediate and harsh punishment by the guards. This forced amnesia was designed to make the captive believe that her life before the arena had never truly existed at all. Without a history to cling to, the prisoner became a shell, a vessel that could be filled with the commands of her master. The wall between the self and the slave was slowly dismantled until the woman forgot the sound of her own true name. The sheer unpredictability of the gladiator's life added a layer of chronic anxiety that prevented the mind from ever finding a moment of rest. A woman might spend months serving one master, only to see him killed in a midday match and be sold to a stranger by sunset. This constant state of flux meant that no emotional stability could ever be achieved, as every connection was subject to the whims of the crowd. The psychological toll of this instability mirrored the physical violence of the arena, keeping the captive in a state of perpetual, low-level shock. Hope, in this context, was not a comfort, but a dangerous liability that only led to further disappointment and pain. Eventually, many prisoners retreated into a catatonic silence, a mental fortress where the horrors of the ludus could no longer reach them. To ensure total compliance, the Romans utilized the public nature of the arena to show the prisoners that their gods had utterly abandoned them. Seeing their sacred symbols mocked or their fellow countrymen slaughtered in the sand served as a visual confirmation of their cosmic insignificance. The spectacle was designed to prove that the Roman state was the only true power in the universe, a force against which prayer was useless. This spiritual isolation was the ultimate cage, trapping the prisoner in a world where mercy was a foreign concept and death was the only escape. Even the stars above the ludus seemed to belong to Rome, shining down on a city that had mastered the art of human degradation. The eradication of hope was complete when the prisoner stopped looking at the sky and began looking only at the dust. By the end of this journey, the woman was no longer a person in the eyes of her captors, nor often in her own. The survival of the body became a cruel irony, a biological persistence that offered no relief from the emotional death she had already endured. Her existence was a testament to the fact that the most effective way to conquer a people is to destroy their belief in a tomorrow. The silence that filled the barracks at night was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating weight of 1,000 extinguished spirits. In the shadow of the Colosseum, the greatest victory was not the one won with a sword, but the one won in the mind. The women of the ludus remained as living monuments to a conquest that was, quite literally, worse than the finality of death.